Welcome back, everyone. I hope it worked well. I know we ran a little out of time, but I hope you at least got to know each other a little bit. Before we move on, I forgot one thing. I realized I never told you guys who I was. So my name is Jasmine Mir. I work for CLIC Europe. We're a partner in the OpenHeritage project. And maybe that's also the good segue we can now use to pass the floor to Hanna Szemzö, who is the coordinator for the OpenHeritage project. She works for the Metropolitan Research Institute in Budapest, Hungary. Even though I don't think she's there at the moment. Hanna, I have too many people on my screen, so I can't see you right now, but I hope, yes,
I'm here.
I hope you're ready. Okay, perfect. Hanna, yeah, thank you for being with us, and I think I'll pass the imaginary mic to you, and go ahead.
Great, thank you, Jasmine. Hello, everyone. My name is Hanna Szemzö, and I'm one of the coordinators of OpenHeritage. And before plunging into the real topic of today, I'll do a very, very short intro of what OpenHeritage is all about. So just about the basics, this is a research and innovation action. It's an H21 project, which means, of course, that it combines research and we actually do things as well. We study cases and policies, but we also evaluating the results, but we also try to do new things in our labs. The project itself started in June 2018 and will last until September 2022. So it's quite a long project. We still have 2 more years to go. And one of the strengths is that it's a very colorful consortium. It has 16 partners coming from 11 different countries, bringing a wealth of experience with themselves, and they are with various backgrounds, universities, SMEs, foundations, and we even have a municipality on board, Lisbon. There is a specific challenge that the project tries to answer and regards how adaptive heritage reuse is practiced. We do have the opinion that despite the changing practices, adaptive reuse is still seen primarily as a public task. And we also think that it's often dealt first very much from the physical point of view, and every other aspect comes later. And still today, a lot of there are a limited range of stakeholders involved, and of course, the project works to change this. So what we try to do is to create a sustainable and inclusive model to support adaptive heritage reuse, and also we are working on a toolbox for supporting this. What we expect from this model, but it's going to be ready in 2 years, is that it's applicable under diverse circumstances, among others in marginalized areas. This has been often a blind spot regarding adaptive reuse. We want this to be able to integrate the opinion of diverse stakeholders, both as initiators and both as people who have opinions and who can influence the outcome of the process. And focusing on one of the challenges that I mentioned, we want this to focus first and foremost on who and how will use the site, and later on the physical aspects. So we want to change this order a bit. It's built on 3 pillars that are integrated together, and we do think that within this integration lies a great strength because they very nicely supplement each other. So we think that there is a stakeholder and community integration, a regional and the resource integration, and they should all be present at the same time. When we talk about stakeholder and community integration, we basically mean to create a socially inclusive process that allows the building of a multi-purpose, multi-stakeholder partnership. When we think about regional integration, we think that the development and the reuse cannot be imagined without the wider territorial scope. And when we talk about resource integration, we think about inclusive business models and also providing economic empowerment to the affected communities. There are some basic assumptions. I think there are 3 most important ones that really guide our work. The first is that the word open is not by chance in the name. Open means that we think that expert knowledge is crucial to determining what heritage is, but that's not the only source. We think that determining the evaluation of heritage and the designation of heritage should be opened up and many more people and influence should be let in. We also think that communities are crucial, but communities are manifold and importantly not necessarily local. So we often use the term heritage communities, meaning that we want to involve people who might not reside locally there, but are connected to the heritage side. And we also have an underlying assumptions that we talk a lot in our work. We think that bottom-up initiatives are good. We accept that people might be of different opinions, but this is a guiding principle of our work supporting them. We do 2 levels of research. One is on macro level. This is the overview of the heritage and adaptive reuse policies in Europe. This is the focus of this dialogue, so you will hear a lot about this. But we also have a micro level research that's 16 observatory cases over Europe. They are not best practices, they are good practices that are interesting from a certain aspect, either from resource integration aspect, or the regional, or even the community integration aspect, so we can learn from them. And what's also important that we bring these two levels together when we think about transferability and when we think about how certain practices can be adapted elsewhere. We also have, of course, heritage labs where we try to practice what we preach. So we try to incorporate some lessons from the observatory cases, and we also try one of the tools that we are developing, one of the things we have been experimenting with. Sometimes with more, sometimes with less success, is an online participatory portal where the communities around the labs can be built, and it has become crucially important in the times of the corona. We do have the 6 labs in Hungary, Poland, Portugal, Italy, Germany, and the UK. 5 are bottom-up initiatives, that 1 is municipal, that's Lisbon. And they are quite various. They include buildings and larger sites. Just go very, very briefly over them. So this is in Warsaw, the Praga neighborhood, which is a working class neighborhood. Here the focus is actually defining what is the heritage of this neighborhood is in the face of rapid gentrification. The second one is in Hofprediker, which is a manor near Berlin, where a co-housing community is being created and on the premises. And the focus of our research is how this community tries to build a relationship, a meaningful relationship with the residents of the village in the area, for whom this site used to be very important, even in the DDR times. In Lisbon, we focus in a former aristocratic home where a social housing complex is being built. In Sunderland, in UK, we have 3 empty buildings that are looking for new uses, but also physical refurbishment, all with the help of the local residents and the involvement of NGOs, and with the support of the local council. In Rome, we have an archaeological park that is a center that has become the center of the neighborhood renewal with the help of a bottom-up organized cooperative. And our last lab is in Pomaz, which is near Budapest, and we focus on a question of how privately owned land, how an architectural site on a privately owned land can be excavated and can be maintained by its heritage community in a sustainable way from a business perspective. This has been a very fast recap, I know, but you can look, I think more is on the website, and I think you'll learn much more about it in the course of this talk. And now I try to, stop sharing my screen. That might take a second. Okay. I think I managed.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Hanna. I think this was very helpful for those of you who did not know OpenHeritage yet. And yeah, I encourage you to look at the website if you now very curious about it. But we're not done with this project just yet, because we're now going to talk about one of the first deliverables we had in this project, which was an analysis or a mapping of current heritage reuse policies and regulations in Europe. It was done by our partners in Newcastle University, and we have Loes Veldpaus here with us today to summarize that for you. We also sent around a newly published nicer summary of it, but I don't expect that all of you read it, 60 pages this morning. So thankfully Liz is with us today. And I think Liz, you're ready to go. The floor is all yours.
Yes, thank you. Hi, So yeah, my name is Loes Veldpaus. I work for Newcastle University. Obviously, the work I'm presenting is a collaborative work between many partners within the project. Let me set up this. Yeah. So the work I'm presenting is a collaborative project, and it's a massive document. The summary has been sent this morning, but there is a much longer document online. If you are interested, feel free to have a look at that one as well. But I will try to give a short overview of this in 15 minutes. You can imagine that it's a 250-page report, so it's going to be a summary. The research was a research on policies and institutional regulatory context within Europe, within the European countries that we are working in OpenHeritage, to understand the heritage and planning context that adaptive reuse happens in, as well as the funding and economic landscape. So we looked at mostly at those, so at heritage planning, but also, of course, building regulations, design, culture policy, sustainability policy, and participation. And we tried to really understand the frameworks, but as well as identify the bottlenecks and barriers within those frameworks on a policy level, let's say, and also, of course, what was considered helpful. So we did this by a policy analysis, as well as some additional interviews in each country to understand how people see those policies, rather than just look at what is said in the policies. And I think one important thing to mention is that we look at heritage as a very broad and inclusive concept. It relates to what Hanna already said, is that we are trying to broaden, let's say, inclusivity in that sense, also through the concepts we use. I will go into more detail on that later. Okay. So just really briefly, these are the 15 countries we looked at, and these are, as I said, the ones that we work in OpenHeritage, either through the observatory cases or the living labs. I'm not going to say anything specific about any of those countries in this really brief summary. There are summary overviews per country, but they are 5,000 words each in that big document online, so feel free to have a look there if you want to know more. Just as a really brief overview, what we found when we were looking at adaptive reuse within the policy context is that actually adaptive reuse as a terminology or as a concept is very often not included in policy. And that can be either because it's a really common thing and it's normal to do it, or because it's uncommon and therefore not there. But also, of course, terminology varies a lot. So in some countries, there are specific words that are used for adaptive reuse, and it's very clear that this is the practice that is meant. In other countries, there are words like conservation, restoration, rehabilitation that are being used also to cover adaptive reuse. So this makes it sometimes a bit complicated to understand which version of the word it's being used or regulated in the policy and legal contexts. Of course, adaptive heritage reuse, as we expected, was mostly regulated through heritage and planning domains. But there are many other domains, as I said before, like culture, sustainability, participation, all influence this. But we also saw, for example, that energy savings programs, but also crisis recovery acts have quite a big influence on if it can happen and how it is facilitated. And then we also saw that, of course, like the Crisis Recovery Act, these are responses to, for example, the financial crisis in 2008, which therefore had quite a big influence on like having adaptive reuse happen, because that was one of the ways of getting out of the crisis, was stimulating some kind of building industry, but through reuse rather than new build. But also, of course, more bigger things like the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2018 European Year of Cultural Heritage we see have quite some influence in at least how countries start to rephrase their policies in relation to adaptive reuse. Another general slide of general findings. So what we also saw is that actually adaptive reuse happens a lot in the exception. So making exceptions by conservation officers, by planning officers within local authorities to allow these processes to happen, or to kind of like make them happen against the odds, is quite common, which also of course means that they are not that policies and regulations are not necessarily facilitative in general. And we saw quite a lot of complexity and contradiction in the systems, which blocks some of the adaptive reuse practices that people want to take on. So the complexity and contradiction, I will talk a bit more in detail, but it relates to both heritage and planning systems, not collaborating, let's say, but also levels of government, where there can be some conflict. And then what we saw was really helpful in some countries is actually temporary reuse or temporary change of use. If that cannot happen through formal procedures, then adaptive reuse tends to be made a bit more difficult. Adaptive reuse by many countries is really seen as a catalyst for development. So this is also how it relates to, for example, those crisis recovery acts. It is a tool for urban regeneration, especially in deprived urban areas, and it's very often sort of like used in the context of increasing the quality of the environment through the character of historic environment, through character of these heritage buildings. There is an idea that you can regenerate areas and increase the quality. Of course, it's also very much linked to either solving vacancy in inner city areas often, or restricting urban sprawl by forcing reuse within the build-up area rather than allow new development outside. And what is also interesting is that adaptive reuse is one of the practices that in many policies and countries in some way is seen as a way to connect heritage with their community. So they can directly use a building that is a heritage building, and this is something that at least some of the countries already want to start to stimulate. So when I say that a lot of these adaptive reuse processes happen in the exception, what I mean is that in policies, well, in heritage policies, of course, there is a way to say this is heritage and this is not, and what is protected is heritage, but not everything that is heritage is protected, or at least not in the same way. So within those concepts, there is already space created where you can sort of negotiate what can happen to a heritage building. Can we reuse it? In what way can we reuse it? What can we change? What can we not change? And this is often also legally kind of broadened by cultural and planning policies. So by using terms like the historic environment, cultural planning, intangible heritage, also, of course, in international conventions, this is used. So the concept of heritage is stretched, is broadened. Words like character, significance, quality of the environment, they are used very often in planning policies, and they create a sort of gray zone where reuse is more likely, but the protection is not so strict as in, let's say, a Grade 1 monument. So here is where we saw adaptive reuse projects happen mostly of heritage buildings, but as I said, heritage defined in a broad sense. So there is a lot of importance within facilitating adaptive reuse on this discretion, especially on a local level, in defining the levels of acceptable change and defining also what is allowed in terms of adaptive reuse. And this very often is actually devolved, at least to some extent, to the local level. So of course, adaptive reuse being mostly regulated through planning and heritage regulation means it often needs approval from both sides. So you need some kind of planning permit or consent, but you also probably need some kind of heritage permit. And this is, yeah, so this kind of integration there is where the discretion can happen. if this is devolved to a level where the decision making is local. So what we saw actually is that planning is very often devolved to local level, which is which makes it easy and very, let's say, direct to the adaptive reuse project. But heritage in some countries really remains, especially when it's formally listed heritage, it remains on a regional level or even a national level, the decision making around what can happen to the building. So this can complicate decision making, because the more decision making on a local level, especially in relation to heritage, the easier it tends to make adaptive reuse processes. So when key decisions are taken on different levels, you can imagine it tends to make things more complicated. And this can be, so as I said, on different levels, but it can also be within different organizations. So in some countries, heritage and planning departments are within the same organization or within the same structure. In other countries, they are much less integrated. And again, it can create some barriers and obstacles. Of course, this system is of levels and different departments, creates quite a sort of like complicated system in some countries, and navigating that system can be really quite difficult. So knowledge of the system, but also being creative in how to use the system and how to navigate some of the risks within the system is a skill that is really necessary to be able to do adaptive reuse projects. And this then kind of like makes it more difficult for some smaller groups or community groups, because they might only be doing this once and might not have this knowledge of the system. Of course, there are also things within policy context. There are not just barriers, there are also things that make things easier and that make things less complicated maybe. One of the main things is definitely flexibility within the way heritage is defined. So if heritage is only A, listed and protected, or B, no protection at all, then it's obviously really much easier when it's not protected, and really difficult when it is protected to do anything in relation to adaptive reuse. If it's more flexible and the framework is defined as a framework of caring for heritage rather than protecting from harm, it seems that it makes things easier in relation to adaptive reuse. As I said, temporary use and temporary change of use, when they are possible, and not a really difficult bureaucratic process, of course, within the formal structures of policy, that makes adaptive reuse easier. Other things we saw was, for example, countries start to make vacancy maps to really make visible and understand the need for reuse in certain areas if there is vacancy, but also then, of course, you need a sort of next step where if there is that kind of vacancy, we also need to understand which are the groups that can maybe, or the users that can go into those buildings. So also matchmaking and matchmakers through websites, but also through, you know, employing people to do this kind of work was seen as quite helpful. This then kind of moves into the whole, well, how can we create a system where we have maybe mentors or people who can help people through those processes, especially if we are trying to stimulate community groups and local groups to do this kind of work, which, as I said, it's difficult to navigate the legal systems, the policy systems. So someone who can help on that and share positive examples, but also peer-to-peer learning is really helpful, as well as, of course, training, events, and taking it more seriously in all levels of education in relation to heritage and architecture and these kind of, and planning, of course. There is, of course, also a procedural side to this. So yeah, if there is advice given or if there is a mentor, this is important, but it's not just what is provided, but also how. So is it free? Is it easily available? Is it in the early stages of the process? Those are all important things. And then, of course, the procedural side of like, are building codes and regulations facilitative, let's say? Can they be used proportional in a flexible way? Are there ways to collaborate with other partners like public-private partnerships, where you can learn from each other and help each other? but also are the way we set up in the building industry, of course, often public tenders and these kind of structures of who gets the building work. Are they actually facilitative of adaptive reuse to be possible? So if they are focused on on construction efficiency and low expenditure, we already kind of rule out some of the adaptive reuse processes because they tend to be seen at least as outside of low expenditure and construction efficiency terminology. And the same goes, of course, for evaluation frameworks within those standards. Just as a last part is of course what is also really important is how adaptive reuse is funded. So there is a sort of formal side to this. There is heritage funding, there are tax reliefs, and of course there is a more, let's say, broader economic side to this, like in terms of branding and marketing and commodification and development. In terms of heritage and funding, like formal funding, what we saw in most countries is that heritage is very much still funded as a thing. So it's for bricks, it's for reconstruction, it's for restoration, and it's not necessarily that there is also funding for use or users, which makes adaptive reuse quite difficult, because if you don't know who is going to be in there, who are you doing that work for? On the other side, what we do see is some other programs like youth programs or cultural programs or creative industries programs that want to be in these kind of buildings with a certain aesthetic and want to be seen as maybe sustainable or reusing buildings because it's cool or hip, and they can apply for funding to be in those kind of buildings. So part of that money will be to make those buildings usable for them, but part of that money is also for them to be a group using those buildings. So this is an interesting shift that you can see happen, that some of the funding is going towards people oriented, but definitely not all of it, and not a lot actually is really focused on community-led redevelopment. So funding those kind of community-led programs, but also the legal structures that come with this, for example, setting up a cooperative, are not necessarily super easy or available for people. I'm just trying to see if I said everything. Yeah, so I think this was a really, really, really brief overview of some of our main findings across Europe. It's very variable in many countries, so please, if you want to know in more detail, have a look at the report or ask. I'm happily available for any questions you have, of course.
Thank you very much, Loes. I think that's a great point. We will give you a chance to ask all the questions you have for Loes in a moment, but we will do this once we're done with all 3 presentations. So if there's anything you want to know or that you want to comment on, please don't forget that, and then we'll get back to it in a little bit. So thank you, Loes, and I will actually move directly on to the next presentation. This will be a presentation from the CLIC project. We're joined by my colleague from eCLA, Allison Wildman. Allison, I have too many people on my screen right now, but I think you're ready. Yeah, there you are. Hi. Perfect. You can share your screen, and you're already doing that. Okay, and then I am giving the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Is it going? No. Now it's going. Can you see?
Yes.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Wildman, and I'm a senior officer in the Governance and Social Innovation Group at eCLA. And I'm one of the contributors to the work on circular governance for the CLIC project. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work as it applies to adaptive reuse of cultural heritage. And I apologize in advance. I have a bit of a head cold, so I am a little slow, which will probably help you. And I might sniff a little bit, so I apologize. The CLIC project is a Horizon 2020 research and innovation project, just like OpenHeritage. but we apply circular economy principles to cultural heritage adaptive reuse. It includes 15 partners in 10 countries and focuses its work in 4 place-based heritage innovation partnerships, or HIPs, who test the project's finance, business, and governance tools and models that are developed during the project in different contexts. Our HIPs are located in Salerno, Italy, Rijeka, Croatia, in the Västra Götaland region in Sweden, and we also have a cultural institution, Pakhuis de Zwijge, sorry, my Dutch is terrible, whose home base is a repurposed warehouse in central Amsterdam in the Netherlands. You can learn a lot more about the project on its website, www.clicproject.eu. But before we get started talking about what I was working on, I'd like to just do a quick plug for the CLIC Startup Competition, which is currently open. The project is calling startups, entrepreneurs, and others from EU and non-EU countries who have developed or are developing ideas that follow sustainable development, social innovation, and ethical finance principles in a variety of sectors. The deadline is the 15th of October. They will select 20 finalists who are going to be invited to participate in a 3-day online seminar in late November. It was a trip to Naples, but thanks COVID. And then 5 winners will be chosen to receive one-on-one mentoring and acceleration services to help bring their idea or product to fruition. So visit the website for more information. There's lots there. This afternoon, I'm going to tell you a little bit about ICLE's little piece of the CLIC project, examining circular governance. As part of the project's circular theme, we wanted to see if we could apply circular economy principles, which are rooted in more material flows and processes, to something a little more squishy like governance. And specifically, we were interested in the governance of cultural heritage adaptive reuse projects. We wanted to know if and how a circular governance approach is being used in cities and in regions. And we wanted to know which governance models and tools can help communities reinvent and revive the functions or uses of cultural heritage assets. But first we had to define what we mean by circular governance. This is a new concept that we had to define a little more discreetly before we could investigate if anyone was actually doing it in practice. So we started with good governance basics, covering principles like participation, inclusion, transparency, and accountability. And then from the literature and best practices, we added collaboration, because we know that a table stands up better with more than 1 or 2 legs. We also included circularity, because that's our overarching theme, but both in the design and development process, it being iterative and focused, and to a lesser extent, dealing with materiality and resource flows, or programming afterwards. And then capping it off, we included fairness and justice to help address things like intangible aspects of cultural heritage, to acknowledge the concept of the commons, and to give voices to the voiceless, like future generations. And the result is that we have an aspirational definition of circular governance, which is a values-based approach for valorizing, protecting, and sustaining cultural heritage assets as an ongoing process. This is iterative, it's an ongoing process to encourage high quality adaptive reuse projects as a common good for society. So, excuse me. We're arguing that circular governance approach is the best approach for adaptive reuse of cultural heritage projects because A, it immediately reduces waste, raw material consumption, and energy use by simply reusing the building. It preserves tangible and intangible heritage elements. It can engage a wider support community for long-term custodianship. It can result in higher quality interventions. And it can foster new cooperation models, new synergistic business, finance, and governance partnership models. Our assertion was that circular governance is a necessary precondition for sustainable adaptive reuse of cultural heritage. The key word being sustainable. This is going on. And our research question was then, what are the factors and conditions that enable circular governance? What are the reasons behind the choice to intervene on a specific site or a building? Is the intervention compatible with the legal and policy framework? Who's involved? Why are they involved? And how do they interact, particularly over the long term? And then what are the factors and conditions that enable or hinder circularity? So with our circular governance definition and our hypothesis and our research questions, we started to investigate cases and to see what we would find. We studied 16 international sites, mostly urban buildings, and completed a literature review on the relevant policies and governance frameworks in those host countries and cities of our cases. And our particular cases didn't have any explicit examples of what we have defined as circular governance, but we did find patterns of what we're calling cultural heritage custodian models. And we took the best parts of these models, these governance models, and applied them to our evolving definition of circular governance. So in a sense, our research process was also circular as we learned more and more from our investigations. I'll quickly go through this, the models to show you what we discovered in our work. When we jumped into the data, we started to see some patterns emerge about the roles and the actors and the stakeholders involved in the processes. And in each case, there was always an owner or someone who's legally responsible for the asset. There was always a funder, someone who had to pay for it or contributed services in lieu of fee for the adaptive reuse. And there was always a manager, someone who was responsible for managing the asset when the project works were complete. And these three roles became the base layer of our diagram. And we found that there were 3 dominant clusters that emerged from our cases, which I'll discuss more in a little bit. On top of this base layer, we added the adaptive reuse project's processes, shown here in the small blue bubbles. They include concept development, renovation, asset management, programming, financing, innovation. And the processes sit at the nexus of the roles. And if you put these 2 layers together, it creates a foundation that helps us visualize who played which role, where, and in what capacity. And it's not a perfect diagram by any means, but it really helped us organize our data and do our analysis and understand the more complex relationships that evolve during these projects. Concept development and renovation are project development related processes that happen mostly in the past. Concept development looks at the ideation process and is a proxy for engagement. Where did the idea come from? Who championed it? Who was included in the process? Who's part of the decision making? Was it part of a larger cultural heritage asset planning process or an inventory? How did they make these decisions? Renovation captures more of the actors involved in the physical rehabilitation of the asset, including the planning and design, the cultural advisory, the consultation, the actual project construction works, and then most notably, of course, who paid for it. Asset management, programming, and financing innovation are current or future processes that are subject to change at any time. Asset management shows who's responsible for the day-to-day management and maintenance of the physical asset. They deal with things like tenant leases and subcontracts and site security and grounds and building, etc. And programming can include a wide variety of actors at a variety of levels, from bottom up to top down. And this process sits at the intersection of manager and funder role, as it's the people involved in the programming and management will contribute to the long-term financial sustainability of that asset. And finally, financing innovation is the place where we captured any stakeholder involvement or mechanisms for unconventional financing schemes that help fund the project, whether it's crowd-based, community resources, or something else. It can deal with either the physical restoration or the ongoing programming. So just here's a general example of what our stakeholder mapping process looked like. We pulled from a long list of heritage community actors, which is a term you heard earlier, which you see on the right side of the screen. And we arrayed them over the process bubbles so that we got an idea of who was participating where. And generally speaking, the more evenly the distributed the actors, the more inclusive and quote unquote circular the process is. We did a diagram for each of our cases using this method. These clustering and mapping processes led to 3 adaptive reuse collaboration models that we're calling custodian models: the public custodian model, the community custodian model, and the private custodian model for the common good. Now, the public custodian model is one in which a public entity, either a local, regional, or national agency or jurisdiction, entirely owns, manages, programs, finances, and governs the adaptive reuse of the heritage asset. And this is perhaps the most traditional governance method, and most of our cases use this model for their projects. It's important to note that even though the public entity plays a central role here, it doesn't preclude involving other actors. It just takes a very prominent leadership and decision-making role. The community custodian model builds on the public custodian model, where the public entity owns the heritage asset, but one or more heritage community actors are responsible for managing the asset. So as a result, the community heritage actors are responsible and directly influence its long-term success and sustainability. This is your typical PPPPP, or your 3P. This is a public/third sector/community sector partnership. And it's largely defined by the owner-manager relationship and how much autonomy and support the public entity, remember who owns the site, gives the heritage community who is managing the site. So you can imagine this model as a spectrum with a lot of different governance variations on its axis. For example, there could be very strong involvement from the public sector, like in our Salerno example, or the public owner may just be a paper owner and not really involved in the project other than just being the legal owner of the asset, like in our Turin example. Now, the private custodian for the common good model is where a private entity owns the asset, but collaborates with public or third sector actors to preserve it as a common good. And the end goal is to preserve and sustainably use the asset and not to commercialize it or make a profit. Or if there is a profit motive, it's to reinvest it in the asset or similar assets, like in the case of Pakhaus, whose owner uses their profits to buy other threatened heritage properties in the Amsterdam area. So this analysis provided the basis of our circular governance approach. Some cases had stronger circular governance elements than others, but many of them were too young to know their whole sustainability story. That's to say, they're still works in progress. We don't know how the story ends with a lot of these cases, and only time will tell if they're truly sustainable financially, culturally, environmentally, or not. These are some of the key challenges from our cases, and I've highlighted the policy-related ones in orange. Loes went over a lot of them, and I really liked her presentation of just nodding along the whole time, because that's also what we found in a lot of our cases. But also, every case was also a special snowflake. There are so many different contexts in which this heritage adaptive reuse happens. There is no one unified storyline along here. So I think this is one also greater challenge for all of us as we work at the European Union level, or if we work internationally. We summarized all of the challenges and some of the responses to them in our deliverable paper, which you can find on the CLIC website. We also published a synthesis report, which is a shorter read and lacks the analysis and all of the juicy details, but it does have nice pictures. So you can go check out that one too on our own website. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the presentation. And I did it in 15 minutes. Yes, thank you.
Yes, Allison, thank you very much. You did perfect with the time. And it was a great presentation. If you hadn't told us that you're a little sick in the beginning, none of us would have noticed. So
I normally talk so deeply like this.
And we're happy you're with us. Yeah, I will encourage you all to ask questions for this in a moment, but we're listening to the third presentation first. and then we can finally get to all the questions and comments. So we're now moving on to Simona Tondelli from the University of Bologna, who's the coordinator for the Ruritage project, and will kind of add on to the two presentations we've heard today, but give it a little bit of a role, perspective and reflection. So Simona, thank you for being with us, and you can get started.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. The previous presentation were very interesting already, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm a full professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Bologna, and I'm the coordinator of Ruritage Age 2020 project, which has a focus on rural regeneration. So we are focusing on slightly different issues than the two previous projects that we have seen, OpenHeritage and the CLIC, but we have also a lot in common talking about heritage, even if, as I was saying, with some different approaches. So I will focus mainly on some case studies that we have developed in our project that started a bit more than 2 years ago. We started in June 2008, like OpenHeritage. We are quite a huge consortium with 38 partners from 19 countries in Europe and also beyond. And we have this great responsibility of being the only EU project funded under this call, under the topic of rural regeneration. Why did we decide to focus on rural areas? For us, rural areas are mainly a place with many opportunities. Almost 1/3 of EU population lives in rural areas, but if we consider also intermediate areas, so the ones that are not urban and not remote rural, we see that we have more than half the EU population living there, and almost the half of the gross value added produced in those areas. And at the same time, those areas are also the place where there are really outstanding examples of cultural and natural heritage. So we find here really huge examples of heritage, not only in terms of tangible heritage, but we work a lot with intangible one. Skills, uses, social practices, languages. So what is connected with the local community, rural communities. At the same time, we also know, we know that rural areas face a lot of challenges, mainly linked with economical, social and environmental problems. So we have the population, disengagement, reduced service provision, problems in accessibility, for example, but also in some cases, the cultural and natural heritage is threatened. So how can we deal with this situation of opportunities, but also of challenges? Ruritage sees the cultural and natural heritage like a driver for sustainable growth. So we work for mobilizing local resources to increase their resilience, and by reinventing business models and governance framework, and by offering innovative tools to local communities, we would like to push social and economic sustainable development in rural areas. And this includes a lot of different ways of practices, going from the reuse and the restoration of buildings to the enhancement of ancient practices through revitalization of traditions or use of rural landscapes. The way we try to reach this aim is our innovative paradigm that can be represented by these images here. We have identified 6 so-called systemic innovation areas, SIAs, which are pilgrimage, food, migration, art and festival, resilience, and landscape, that are areas in which to work, in which to find solutions through a transversal and holistic approach. So only by working together and transversal in these 6 fields, we believe that it is possible to build a new rural regeneration paradigm. As I was saying also in my introduction, adaptive reuse is not one of our main focuses. So the interesting thing is that when I was asked to participate in this workshop, I had to think a bit about adaptive reuse in Ruritage. And what I discovered is is something that also Hanna was saying in her presentation. So even if we do not work directly on the reuse of buildings, we see that starting from the need of possible uses of different practices, we then have as a consequence the adaptive reuse of many buildings and also open spaces. So I will present you some examples from our case studies, which are both role models, so really outstanding examples of rural regeneration, and replicators, so our pilots that are now implementing regeneration plans. The first example that I want to show you is what we call the Rural Heritage Hub. For us, the regeneration process starts from the community, so we need a place where to make the local community, the citizens, the stakeholders discuss, talk, decide about their future, find their own way to rural regeneration, and this has to be a physical place. Physical place that in many cases was a place of the memory, or a place that was really known by the local community, like a former school, a former nursery school. But what is interesting is that working for the project in restoring this hub, this place, we were also able to introduce in the same place many different activities. So, for example, in the case of Izmir, in the hub of Ruritage project, they also host training courses, other activities. In Appignano del Tronto, in this former nursery school, they host performances, they host meetings, trainings, gym courses, and so on. But also reading our approach to adaptive reuse through our 6 SIAs, we see some different and interesting examples. For example, starting from landscape SIA, what we can notice is that in rural areas, often we do not have huge and listed monuments. Of course, there are also those, but we also have a diffused heritage, which is made by, let's call them common buildings, common, not so important buildings that are underused or unused, and that build an opportunity for new functions. So one case is the Albergo Diffuso, the dispersed hotel. This example I show you is the Yuraki Bey village in Izmir, Turkey, which is one of our replicators, which is working on promoting cultural tourism in Izmir. And one action connected with cultural tourism is the promotion of private initiatives to transform some local buildings that are no more used in hotels, in accommodations for visitors. Second example is in the SIA pilgrimage. Also in this case, we can find a lot of adaptive reuse cases, both of sacred spaces, but also of the many buildings that are along the routes. So for example, in the case of Camino de Santiago, which is one of our role models, we have this old monastery that is used as hub of the project, but that also hosts an hotel with more than 300 visitors. But we also have many cases of reuse of buildings for creating albergs, restaurants, bars, shops along the routes. In the case of resilience, there are even more examples. For us, resilience is the capacity of reacting of the community after a disaster that can be natural, like in the case of Appignano del Tronto. The pictures that you see here are from this municipality in Marche region in Italy, where there was the earthquake in 2016, but also after a social or economic event, disaster, like, for example, the COVID. We also collected a lot of practices following COVID-19, a call for practices in spring this year. So in this case, new functions can be introduced in old buildings, but also public spaces can change their function. In the case of art and festivals, yeah, we have even more examples of adaptive reuse of space, not only of underused or unused spaces, but also of contemporary different uses of the same space, and sometimes also at the same time. What is different in rural areas from urban one is that often we have many different venues that can be available at affordable prices. And the contexts are often very inspiring, attractive in rural areas, and can be linked to other cultural offers. So, for example, in the case of our role model Take Art in UK, they have these rural touring performances that take place in many different places, like community rooms or pubs and so on. But we also have activities that can be hosted in more important, let's say, listed buildings, like in the case of Slovenia, in the Negova Castle. For what concerns food, we see, and we are all aware of these changes in the last decades about the introduction of tourism, agricultural tourism. So this possibility to turn farms into hospitality places. So we see agritourism, we see the possibility to connect strongly the local products, local food production with cultural tourism, but we also see some experiences that take place trying to connect citizens and farmers, city and rural areas in very different settings. And for the last SIA, we have two very interesting examples. The first one is from Piam in Asti, in Piemonte region in Italy, where this NGO, Piam, which works with migrants, was obtained the gratuitous loan of a property, Villa Quaglina, which is this huge building, and they started to renovate it to offer a shelter to migrants. But the interesting thing is that they also involved the migrants in the renovation process. So while offering them a shelter, they also taught them some skills in the building sector. So they had this double success in renovating, in adapting the use of this old building for this new purpose. And in the same area, again in Asti, we have also another example of intangible reuse, I would say, because they are also working, integrating migrants in agriculture. And what they have experienced is the adaptation of agriculture, in this case, wine production, by mixing local production, Barbera, with the wine coming from the Eastern Mediterranean areas, which is Syrah, and giving birth to a new wine called Modibò that they are now cultivating and selling on the website. And I think this is a good synthesis of what adaptive reuse should mean. So it's something that is already there, but where you bring new energies, new ideas, and new purposes to create something new. And to finish my presentation, I would share with you some conclusions, some considerations about what we learned from our role models, from the processes that we analyzed, about the governance that facilitates rural regeneration. So first of all, we see that collaboration among stakeholders is fundamental, but also training is crucial to transform initial capitals into job and economic opportunities working in rural areas, what we see is that the main capitals that are available are human and social capitals. So they are struggling a lot with financial capital sometimes, but the rural areas are really rich in human and social capital. One other point we have analyzed is the need of having key stakeholders with leadership and influence capacity to lead the path, so to guide this regeneration process. And also the one result was to understand that the success of the regeneration processes that we have analyzed is mainly linked with the ability to adapt, so with the resilience also of the stakeholder in facing unexpected circumstances and be able to integrate the opportunities coming from these unexpected circumstances within the process that had been fixed before. So often the actions are not consecutive in the process, but coexist. So this great capacity of adapting to the circumstances is really fundamental for the success of regeneration processes. And finally, the successful types of governance models that are linked with the regeneration practice analyzed in Ruritage are the one with a high level of community participation. Community participation shows to be one of the key factors in rural regeneration and is at the base of every action that should be taken in rural areas for promoting sustainable growth. Every information and details on the case studies that I have presented, of course, are on our website, so you are welcome to go there and have more information about them. Thank you for your attention, and I'm available for explanations.
Thank you, Simona. I know we already had a couple of questions come in, but just a reminder, this is now the time when you finally get to ask all your questions. So not just for Simona, but also for Loes and Allison. We have about 10 minutes. So again, you can raise your hand or you can put your questions in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and address the questions that we have here from Ruritage to you, Simona. So one we had from Mark Watson. Can a dispersed hotel avoid some of the problems of Airbnb, which has had a negative effect in some overheated places, pushing out some lower term rentals and homeowners?
I think this is a very controversial issue because dispersed hotels have a lot of positive effects on the local communities, but what is needed to avoid negative impacts is a huge involvement of the local community in this action, because we also have seen cases in which this operation, if it is guided by an investor coming from outside, just buying the buildings and pushing away local communities, this can be something very, very negative. So I think that we can have a balance in some way this effect, these problems of Airbnb, or also of these villages that turn out as hotels but are abandoned by the local population. But this process has to be planned and guided with this strong involvement by the local stakeholders and the local population. Otherwise, the risk is to have the opposite effect, and so.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. We have actually a second question to you that I'll add right away. Are you going to use the musealization strategy as a conservative adaptive reuse pillar?
I'm not sure I really can understand what you mean with musealization strategies.
Maybe if Mohammed, if you could unmute yourself and briefly explain or put it in the chat.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Simon. Yeah, visualization that, I mean, you can revive practically the expression of construction of intangible heritage. So the visitors, they can come to the rural area and to apply all of these values in reality, not just to live in the context and get services, but they will leave for 3 or 4 days in according to specific itinerary, and they will wear as the traditional clothes. They will apply and implement the activities, traditional habits and traditions that already happened by the local people, and also they can apply the traditional construction like mud brick or according to the material, whatever, that's not a point. Because in France, you can review projects there, they now already around now, 10 years ago, applies this perspective, creating or rebuilding a new castle according to medieval ages construction methodology in traditional way, and they invite visitors to join them. They pay tickets and getting the funding through this visitation, that the visitors come and pay money and join the construction process wearing the traditional clothes of builders and the supervisors and people who living in this area and living in the rural context in traditional way. That's the visualization. And I already read many researches about this perspective and try to, through my last research, to you modify some changes and to recommend something for Egyptian rural heritage to implement.
We don't have that much time for the questions. Could you
That's not
try to
questions.
wrap it up?
You said for me to clarify the expression.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To me. No, we do not work on this perspective. We have different way of approaching the regeneration and the integration of people within rural areas. For example, we work with festivals, a traditional one. In Visegrad, we have this medieval festival, which is very popular. But the way we work with this sort of things is more about, on one side, to destagionalize the tourism, so to have different sort of events during the year to show the traditions, but we work a lot also in trying to integrate new uses, new purposes, new businesses in the rural areas. So we are not working a lot on make people experiences all the activities, for example, but of course we want to keep art crafts and skills alive, but we would also like to have new businesses, new people bringing their new activities in the rural areas.
All right, thank you. If you have some more questions to Ruritage, put them in the chat and I will see that Simona can maybe get back to you in writing, because we also do have some questions for OpenHeritage and CLIC. I want to start with you, Beitske, who had a question for CLIC, and I think you can just unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Yeah.
Beitske, I think your sound is not as you intended to be.
I was very triggered by the
Hold on, Beitske.
models that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think yes. Start over. Yeah, it's good now.
Yeah. Okay. My notebook was on my microphone. Sorry. I was triggered by the custodian models that CLIC presented, and especially by the middle one, because in the left one.
Yeah, it's not working. If you try turning off your camera,
the
maybe.
Heritage is fully in public hands,
Or
maybe we could have her put it
I'm sorry.
in.
Yeah, just put it in the chat, and we will then answer it. In the meantime, Loes, I'm gonna ask you one of the questions for OpenHeritage. We have one from Aish Varia, and she said, did you find any specific policy context which built in a resilience to market-led dynamics or control of gentrification through adaptive reuse projects? The question is in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, within the policy context that we looked at for this specific deliverable, the focus usually is on development and growth. So there is not necessarily the willingness to, you know, curb gentrification. But then within the case studies, we have one case study where is Stiftung Trias involved. Rolf is also here in the webinar. And they have developed this tool where they are separating the land from the property, so the building from the land, where through controlling the land and having ownership of the land, you can control, like, not the land value in itself, of course, but you can control who it goes to. So the community has the control, or the trust that Rolf works with. He can maybe explain in more detail later how this works, but there are these kind of tools. I think in policy and a legal context, we haven't found a lot of them, because that's not really usually the aim of these kind of policies.
Hanna, did you want to add something to that?
Just one thing that I think it's just basically adding to what Loes was saying, that I think it's also a different focus. So to combat gentrification, you would have to look at local housing policies. I mean, many cities have them, and just as Loes mentioned, we have Rolf, who's here and also part of the consortium. And I think his work is also built on many of the local housing policies that German cities follow. So it's also the question of what's the focus of the deliverable.
Yeah, we didn't look at those.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question for CLIC that is in the chat. So Allison, I'm going to direct this to you. Is there a guidance or an evaluation process that can assess the impact of heritage adaptive reuse? And if so, does this involve also the type of technical interventions for the adaptation of heritage?
I think the short answer is I don't know, me personally, but this is something that I can check in with the team maybe and fish around, so I can come back with an answer if I find one.
Okay. Thank you. We have a bunch of more questions, so I will try to sort them a little bit and then pass them on to our presenters so they can get back to you directly. There was one that I would like to actually close with, because I did like the question, which was from Eva, or I'm not sure where you're from, but it was for all three of you, so if you could briefly say something. For decades, the debates on heritage have been dealing with registered lists or things related to the past. So she admires the open approach and the presentations today, in particular working on living heritage and the importance of heritage adaptation and development. So the question she has is, how do you work with local communities to dismantle some of their previous held stereotype beliefs about heritage? Whoever.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think this is definitely, it's local communities, but it's broader than that. This is definitely a really important question, because yeah, obviously many communities have a very particular idea of what heritage is. So it's a castle or a church, or in other texts it might be something very different. But I think partly actually the fact that it's local communities starting these processes with a building. And then later on, the discussion goes around, like, what is what you value about these buildings, and why are we doing some adaptive reuse process with those rather than something else? Then you can start the conversation about heritage, even without naming that it's heritage, right? Because I think that's very often already kind of triggering certain ideas that maybe we don't want in these conversations. But I think it's also really important to challenge this, and so to talk about it with local communities, because their idea of heritage, or a specific story they relate to a certain type of heritage or a certain building, is only one story. And we need to make sure that we are open to, like, the multiple stories that are within a building or within a site, to make sure that you know, by building this heritage community in one way, we don't exclude many other people that also feel some connection to that site, but don't have the capacity or the willingness or I don't know, the time even to engage with a site or a building in that way. So yeah, I think it's a really important question, and there is no one answer, of course. And I think within adaptive reuse, we need to be really careful that we don't kind of like push aside those questions that are very much questions asked in the heritage sector by saying, oh, but it's sustainable, oh, but it's economically viable, and therefore we should do it anyway, even if this community, you know, is saying something else, or is not so interested, or is interested, but we don't think it's usable, let's say. So these are, yeah, I think there are various answers to this question, but it's definitely one that needs to be asked much more. Thank you.
All right, great, thank you. I don't know, Simona or Allison, if you want to add anything onto this, or if you're happy with that response. Okay, looks good. Okay, perfect. Then I think we'll close it here. As promised, we'll try to get back to as many questions as possible in the chat. So if the three of you could have a look at that. Simona, I saw you were already active here. And we will now have a short break.